Welcome to Talk is Sheep, the official podcast of the Wild Sheep Society of British Columbia. Brought to you by our title sponsor, Mountain Tough Fitness Lab. Come along with us as we take conversations that matter to you into the high alpine. We have partnered with Mountain Tough Fitness Lab to help get you in shape and mentally stronger. Whether you're a veteran hunter or just starting out, the Mountain Tough app will take you to the next level. We personally train using the Mountain Tough programs, and we believe in it so much that we want to give you 6 weeks for free using code SHEEPBC. That's SHEEPBC. Check out Mountain Tough Fitness Lab. You won't be disappointed. This episode is sponsored by our conservation partner, Yeti. Thank you Sitka Gear and Yeti for investing in healthy wildlife and sustainable ecosystems. Good morning, Cait. Welcome to Talk is Sheep. It's awesome to finally get on a podcast with you and chat what's going on in your world.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, likewise. So for our guests, let's just talk a little bit about who you are, where you're at, and kind of what you're involved in these days.
Sure. So I'm a wildlife health biologist. That's my title. Currently with the Fish and Wildlife branch, and we're sitting in the Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship right now. So, I joined the BC Wildlife Health Program back in 2006, and so I've been with that group for some time now. It wasn't the path that I was expecting. I studied marine ecology in university, but had an opportunity to work with Helen Swansha. I met her through another project back in the summer of 2006, and I was just sort of impressed by her, as many people are, right? She's just this badass wildlife veterinarian and doing really cool work. And so luckily she, saw something in me and invited me to join her team, and I learned everything on the job. Helen's a great teacher, so started getting involved with different wildlife health projects and just kind of supporting Helen in the work that she was doing. And over the years, did some CWD sampling trips with her. She had started the chronic wasting disease surveillance before I joined, but became more involved, and then she sort of handed me the reins of that program a number of years ago now. Gosh, I've lost count, maybe like 10 or 12 years ago. She sort of put that on my desk, and back in those days, we were obviously really concerned about chronic wasting disease. We were looking at what was going on in some other places, our colleagues in Alberta and down south, and it was clearly a real challenge. And so in those days, we were still saying BC was pretty low risk for chronic wasting disease, but in particular hunters that were going to these other places, it's something they should know about. And anyway, so when I took over the program, it was a different situation that we're in today. So things have evolved, and I'm continued to learn a ton. From Helen, and of course Helen retired a couple of years ago, now working under Dr. Kylie Thacker, and she's also amazing. And we're tackling these tricky issues around wildlife health as a team, and here we are today.
Awesome. So I've got a whole bunch of things I want to dive into, but really the crux of the decision or the podcast was to discuss CWD. So let's dive right into it. So you talked about how things have changed. We're low risk, and now things are a little bit different. So where do we sit? What's our current status? Actually, you know what? Let's start right at the front end. What is CWD? Sort of, where does it come from? Why is it important? Why do we need to pay attention to it? Let's start there, Cait.
Yeah, good. Good starting point. So chronic wasting disease is an infectious disease that affects species of the deer family. So cervids, both deer species, mule deer, white-tailed deer, moose, and elk. We've had cases in all those species in North America. We also believe that caribou are susceptible to this disease. Haven't had any cases confirmed in North America, but of course the CWD outbreak in Scandinavia, we've seen it impacting reindeer over there, and some other cervids. Yeah, it's 100% fatal in all the animals that become infected, and we still don't have any, treatment or vaccine. So once an animal becomes infected, they will die. So of course there's conservation concerns on that front, but yeah, it's caused by this abnormal protein called a prion. The protein is misfolded, and so it's not doesn't act like protein should in the body. We all have these proteins in our bodies, and what they're meant to do is kind of break down into their component parts. But these disease-causing prions will accumulate in the body. They accumulate particularly in the central nervous system and in the brain, and so ultimately it causes a neurological disease. So it's a terrible disease, a terrible outcome for those animals, and throughout that course of the disease, the animals are able to shed that disease agent into the environment and expose other animals, either directly through nose-to-nose contact or into the environment. And yeah, there's still a lot we don't know about prion diseases. They're very tricky. Other prion diseases that people may be familiar with are, mad cow disease is sort of the cattle version, BSC. There's some human prion diseases. There's prion disease that affects sheep and goats called scrapie. But CWD is very different. These different prion diseases are quite different. And one of the most challenging aspects of CWD is that it can get into the environment. So infected animals will shed this into the environment, contaminate those environments, and there's not really anything we can do to, decontaminate, to clean up those environments once the prions are in the soil, on the plants, in the water. They're basically indestructible. They're resistant to standard disinfectants. They're resistant to burning. And so one of the only real ways to sort of deactivate these prions is through, high heat extended incineration. And so it just makes it really tricky, especially when the disease gets into a free-ranging population. So, there's been major challenges with cervid farming. Captive herds of deer and elk become infected on these farms. That's been a real issue, but yeah, it's also gotten into wild populations and spread around. So, we don't really know exactly where it came from. We don't know for sure, but the first documented cases of chronic wasting disease were down in the States, in Colorado and Wyoming in the 1960s. And they didn't really know what the disease was at that time. But 10 or 15 years later, they described it as this prion disease, described it as chronic wasting disease later on. But by that time, it had spilled from these captive populations into the wild, and it had moved around quite a bit. It was introduced to Canada in the 1990s through farmed elk, and it can spread from captive to free-ranging populations and vice versa. We now know that it can, because it can get into the environment and get into plant material like hay and grain. So now we know it can move around on that plant material as well. It can move around on an infected carcass. And so there's a number of different ways it can get into the environment and spread around. We in the last 20 years, we've learned so much about this. When jurisdictions were first really starting to try and manage this, we didn't have all that information. So I guess in a way we sort of have the benefit of all the lessons learned and all the unfortunately for some places it has been a real challenge, and the disease has really taken hold of populations in different places, and there's not much we can do at this point. So we're just kind of watching it. So BC is kind of in this enviable position where we haven't detected it yet, and we have a lot of knowledge now that has been generated over the last couple of decades that we can learn from. Mistakes were made, and we can learn from those mistakes. We have not great tools in terms of management, but some better tools. And so we're just trying to do everything we can in BC to focus on prevention. We anticipate that it will enter BC if it's not already here. It's not a matter of if, it's just when we're going to get that first detection, and hopefully we're going to catch it early. And so we're trying to prepare for that. We're trying to work through some scenarios and different management options of how we're going to tackle it here. So we've been watching this situation evolve over the last since I've been part of the program 16, 17 years. We've gone, like I said, from a low risk situation to, okay, it's on our border, if not in BC. We just haven't tested it. We haven't detected it yet. It is a tricky one for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I've got all kinds of questions. So forgive me, and that, these are always really fun for me because I learn so much. But so there's the Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, which is obviously in humans. Are these? And you talked about these prions. So we got CWD, we got mad cow, we've got a whole host of them. Mm-hmm. Are they all kind of interrelated? Or is it just a terminology in the species? For example, the cervids versus cows versus humans. Are they all kind of the same thing, or are they completely different?
They're related in that they are caused by a prion. They're caused by this abnormal misfolded protein. Yeah, the various diseases are quite different. And again, there's a lot we don't know about them. Things like scrapie's been around a little bit longer. We know a little bit more about that. But even from mad cow disease compared to chronic wasting disease, for example, the disease cycle with mad cow disease, cattle actually have to consume infected meat to become infected, and then they don't shed the disease agent into the environment like we see with chronic wasting disease. And so when a cattle population becomes infected, if you depopulate that, you remove those animals, then you've sort of stopped that disease cycle. It's not into the environment, it's not persisting. So that's not the case with CWD, and that's something that we've learned, right? And years ago, when captive populations became infected, they would depopulate farms, like herds on farms, to try and break that disease cycle without knowing that it was in the environment, right? And so they would introduce healthy animals back onto those properties, and then they would pick it up. So that's really tricky. And that's, so that's just one example of how these different prion diseases are different. But basically as a group of diseases, they're part of a group of diseases called TSEs. Transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And so basically what that means is, you're able to transmit the disease between animals. The encephalopathy means the disease of the brain, and the spongiform in the middle, I did that in the wrong order. Spongiform actually describes the result, what happens, the pathology of the brain tissue. And so when these prions accumulate in the brain, because they're not functioning like normal proteins, they will actually cause cell death and tissue death. And so what you actually end up with is holes in the tissue, holes in the brain tissue. And so you get these sponge-like appearances. And you can see that in, images of the infected brain tissue under a microscope. It looks like a sponge. And so, those types of characteristics sort of group these different prion diseases in that family of diseases. But they're very different. They don't tend to cross species very easily. And so, that's why we say CWD is believed to only affect species in the deer family or cervids under natural conditions. We haven't had any cases of CWD in other species or species groups in a natural condition. But obviously, there's been research that's tried to push that and tried to get a better handle on potential transmission to other species. Could it transfer to primates? Looking at that human health risk, and the results are still sort of inconclusive, I guess. Some of the findings of some different research has been inconsistent, and so through research, they have been able to push what we call that species barrier, and so by literally injecting infected material into animal, brains, or in some cases even just feeding contaminated meat to animals, they have been able to transmit that disease to other species group. But we haven't seen any of that in under natural conditions. Yeah.
So is there any risk to anyone if you ingest a CWD infected carcass? Is there any issue there? Or?
Yeah, so I'm not a human health person, but like expert, I kind of stay in my animal health role. But we work pretty closely on CWD with our public health or human health colleagues for their advice on this. And what they recommend, and this is coming from the World Health Organization, Health Canada, the various public health agencies, is that there's never been a documented case of CWD in a human, but because the research has been sort of inconclusive, we can't rule it out entirely. The risk is probably low for transmission to people, but public health recommends that any animal that's infected with CWD is not consumed. And so just a precautionary approach is warranted in this situation until we know more.
Okay, so now you talked about CWD, not sort of, there's no knowledge of it changing species like from cervids to primates, for example, but do you have cases where you feel that maybe mule deer infected whitetails or whitetails infected moose or elk? Is there evidence of that, where that's happening?
Yeah, we think so. I mean, once, as far as I know, once the disease is in a population or in the environment, it can transmit from different cervid species. So we know some of the cases that we've had in other places, of course, like in Alberta, where we've had cases in moose, CWD cases in moose. They've popped up in areas where there was a mule deer population, an endemic CWD in a mule deer population, and so the cases in moose were sort of associated with overlap with the mule deer population. Whether they're getting it from those animals or from the environment or some kind of like shared food, if there's like like bait stations and things like that, agricultural areas where animals are aggregating or kind of sharing food sources tend to be areas where high disease transmission, high rates of disease transmission can happen. So yeah, we know that it can move between species.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned one of the things that the disease is really, really challenging to kill, like high heat is one of the only things. So how long will it persist? Say, for example, there's a contamination, there's a dead animal and it's, infected the soil. How long will that hang around for? Like, are we talking months, years, decades?
We don't really know. I think some of the best information we have about how long these prions can survive in the environment, I think, come back to the prion that we see with scrapie. So in sheep and goats, there's been some research looking at that prion in the environment, and it was over 15 years, and we didn't actually know the endpoint, but they had tested environmental samples after 15 years, and those prions were still active in the absence of sick animals. So we suspect, and of course we want to, we don't know for sure, but we want to sort of take a conservative approach, right? In that likely years, we don't know for sure, but once CWD prions enter the environment, we're assuming it's going to be years. We don't know how long. Yeah.
Okay, so now from a resolution perspective, obviously, prevention is the biggest thing. But now that, if you have a disease event, obviously no treatment for it. There's no vaccines. There's no magic bullet that's going to fix and make CWD go away. Is there any research being done on it? I get it. It's wild animals. So, how do you treat wild animals? That's problematic. We know this about Movi, even if there was a cure. How do we treat those animals? But what does that look like moving forward? Is there research being done in that area?
Yeah, and I'm not super familiar with it, but I do know that there is research being done to try and develop a treatment or vaccine for CWD, and that's driven largely by the producers, the deer and elk farming industry, right? Because that's what they would like, and treatment of those animals in a captive setting is obviously more practical. So I know there has been a lot of effort in that and a lot of research, but nothing really reliable has come out of that yet. I mean, there's some places have said that they have a vaccine, but we haven't seen a solid product yet. And then of course, application to wildlife is another story, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a few issues with that, right? Trying to capture thousands of mule deer and treat them. Yeah, good luck.
Yeah. I think we're best off to just try and prevent it, or at least do everything in our power to limit negative impacts, right? So we expect it's going to come to BC. Where it pops up, we don't know, which is kind of a scary thing, right? The ability for the disease to come in on an infected carcass or through contaminated hay means that it could really pop up anywhere. And so we are, trying to do testing and surveillance of cervids in every corner of BC in an effort to try and stay ahead of it. Another very likely way that it will come into BC is just through infected live animals just moving over the border. And so the proximity of the cases down sort of in the southeast part of the province makes that area probably the highest risk for the disease coming in. We have cases on the sort of southern part of the Alberta-BC border. Alberta has an extensive surveillance program, and they've been very generous with their data every year to help us to inform sort of the risk for BC. But yeah, we know that there's cases in both mule deer and white-tailed deer right on the BC border on the Alberta side now, well within the range of just natural animal movement. Similarly to the south, we've got a CWD outbreak in northeast Montana, around the Libby area, mainly affecting white-tailed deer, but I think they've had a couple cases in moose now. There was also an elk farm affected down in that area, and so again, well within the range of natural animal movement, and yeah, spread into Idaho last year as well. So So, in that zone, kind of southeast BC is where we're doing the majority of our testing to ensure that we pick it up, we detect it as soon as possible. We've had to implement some mandatory testing for mule deer and white-tailed deer, harvested mule deer and white-tailed deer down in that area to try and boost our surveillance numbers. Because unfortunately, I mean, to be perfectly honest, Kyle, the number of animals that we're testing in BC right now is not providing the confidence that we need to confirm our disease status, to confirm whether or not CWD is in BC. And so we had to implement that mandatory testing down in the southeast, to provide that confidence. So we have fairly good confidence in, those management units right along the border. But the rest of, Region 4, the rest of BC, our numbers are so low right now that I'm worried that the disease is going to come in and it's not going to be detected right away because we do need to test a lot of animals. And so our goal is to test as many animals as we can through animals that are already being removed from the landscape, right? So that's hunter harvested animals. Roadkill animals are also really a really important sample for us. Still about 80% of our samples are coming from hunters, and so that's like such an important partnership there, working with the hunting, with the communities and hunting organizations to access those samples. It's voluntary in most parts of the province, but really highly encouraged. So yeah, we're always trying to get those numbers up. That's going to be really important because if the disease comes into the province and we don't detect it right away, and we've seen this in other places where, different places in the States, they get their first detection and they'll do some more sort of targeted sampling in that area and find out that, in fact, 20% of the animals are infected with CWD. And at that point, there's just nothing we can do about it. There's no management action that's going to be effective. You just kind of have to wait, monitor from that point. But there's other examples in the States where they've had really good surveillance programs and they've detected the disease early. We qualify it through like a disease prevalence percentage. So places like Illinois detected CWD where they figured it was still in less than 1% of the animals they were testing. So that indicates that they caught it really early before it had a chance to get into the environment and take hold of that population. And so they've been able to apply some really effective management because they caught it early and they act quickly. And through, mainly harvest management, which is the recommendation now, is sort of the most important tool for managing CWD is hunting and harvest management. They've been able to maintain a low disease prevalence of under 3% of the population now over 20 years. So with CWD, the goal, of course, is always going to be to eradicate it, but I really don't think that's likely. There's basically, nowhere else has been able to eradicate the disease entirely because of the whole environmental contamination aspect. But if we can catch it early and be, really smart about our management approach, take the time to understand the dynamics of that disease outbreak and, focus in on animals that are most likely to be infected, tighten up our preventative measures in terms of limiting the potential to spread, limiting disease transmission, then, I think we've got a chance to contain it. But yeah, it's really key to all of this is to catch it early. And in order to do that, we need to improve and enhance our testing, our surveillance right now.
So I know with, we sit on the Provincial Hunting Trapping Advisory Team, and there's a number of stakeholders, and there's widespread support from the organizations. how are the hunters of British Columbia? Are you seeing buy-in? Are you seeing people keen to support, or are you getting kind of that pushback where like they're not interested in helping? So
Yeah.
what does that look like? And I'm also curious about your numbers. So you talked about stats. How many heads are you getting? How much testing are you able to get a year at currently?
Okay. Yeah, let's come back to the surveillance stats because that's key. But I want to talk a bit about our collaborative team for a while, because I think that is so essential for effective management and our success against CWD in BC. So coming back to Helen in those early days, and in her wisdom, she set up some working groups, which the Wild Sheep Society was part of that from day one. A lot of the number of the hunting organizations, some other agency partners, and some CWD experts were all part of that group. Helen set up these working groups with the intention that if we were going to do this right, we needed to have a collaborative approach. And so hunting organizations have been such a important partner in that. So we've developed our CWD plan. It's a surveillance and response plan for CWD in BC. That's it's available on our website if anyone wants to have a look at that. But we developed that collaboratively. Everyone was able to provide input and help guide what we're doing in BC. So I think that really strengthens everything that we're doing in terms of the prevention, the regulations that we've developed over the years, our strategies for surveillance and accessing samples for testing. And now, like present day, we're talking a lot more about response planning and scenarios and how we want to manage CWD when it's detected in BC, kind of running through those scenarios, running through what our collective objectives are for wildlife, and what type of management tools what kind of management tools will be available to us to achieve those objectives. So in general, I would say our hunting partners, like local communities, right up to the leadership of the different hunting organizations and NGOs have been very supportive, and also with First Nations partners. We're building our partnerships with First Nations on like the provincial scale, also within communities with some on the ground kind of workshops and different things. Overall, there has been great support. Everyone sort of has the same goals here when it comes to chronic wasting disease, right? Everyone wants healthy wildlife, resilient populations, sustainable populations. They want access to for game meat that they know is healthy and good for them and good for their families. We're all on the same page here. So in general, the support has been great. I think some of the barriers maybe, or the struggles that we've been having in terms of accessing samples has really been around lack of awareness. And we think education and just building awareness around the program, around what we're trying to do, also around like the risks that could bring CWD back, with the human-related activities, importing carcasses and contaminated hay or grain, all that is really important. And having, strong, opportunities to do outreach, having a strong sort of outreach campaign is really key. But we've struggled with that. It's hard. We're a pretty small program, and so getting the word out and really reaching everybody. I still talk to lots of folks that are not aware of the program we have in BC, even though I feel like it's all I do is just try and get the word out there. But I think that's probably one of our main barriers, is that people just aren't aware of what's going on and they're not aware of the program. But I think there's signs that we're building awareness, but there's still a lot we can do. When I get the opportunity to actually have a conversation with somebody, it usually ends up being pretty positive. But it's just connecting with those people it's kind of hard to do sometimes.
Well, it's great, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast to talk about this, and hopefully we can get the message out and our listeners can share that. You were at the Victoria Outdoor Show, I think it was last year or earlier this year, I guess it was, and that was a great opportunity. I think we're trying to get you to the Mountain Hunting Expo in Penticton, and I think that's a good venue because it's right on the border there, right? So you're getting the word out, and it's great that you're having those dialogues. So on that subject, how close, I know it's on the doorstep, but how close is CWD? That you talked about some of these animals that are kind of, it's within their natural range, but it hasn't been detected. So how close are we, and how big of a risk is it for BC?
Yeah. So we have, I don't have the data from Montana or Alberta from this season, but from last year, we have confirmed cases within 40 kilometers of the BC border, both into Alberta and down into Montana. Those are the closest cases. But, both Alberta and Montana have done quite a bit of testing through hunter samples, sort of in, near or adjacent to the BC border. So we have quite a lot of data that are animals that have tested, and come back negative, which is good. But we know that there's definitely cases, and every year there's more cases, and every year those cases move closer to the BC border. My concern is that there may be infected animals in BC right now, and we just haven't detected it yet. So I would say in the southeast part of the province, for sure, we're very high risk for getting a positive detection. It could be this year, it might not, it might be next year. Best case scenario is that we get our first positive, in these areas in the southeast where we're doing a lot of testing, because we will have pretty good confidence that we'll catch it early because we are testing so many more animals down in that part. My biggest fear is that we get our first positive in the Dominica or in the caribou regions where we're really not doing much testing at all, and so the disease could be introduced to those populations and sort of go unchecked for a period of time. We also, we have really strong relationships with partners in the southeast and up in the Peace region, in the Okanagan. Like we've been building our working groups, and all of the local contacts have been incredibly supportive in those areas and are really well informed, I think, through the different information sessions that we've done through working group meetings. And so we'll be able to respond quickly with a really strong team. But yeah, we need to continue to build that capacity in other places too, just in case it does pop up somewhere else.
Right. So now I know Alberta really struggles, particularly with mule deer, but you talked about these other species. Is it only deer we're testing in BC, or we're testing all cervids, or what does it look like data-wise?
Yeah, we're interested in testing all cervids. So we test any mule deer, white-tailed deer, moose, elk, or caribou that we can access. Most of those samples are coming from hunters, but we'll also collect roadkill if we can. The trappers have been really supportive in collecting submitting heads of the roadkill they're collecting for bait. We have some highway crews. We're always trying to, build a system with the highway crews that are picking up roadkill to access some of those animals, because we know we are missing a lot there. And then, any other opportunistic sample, if it's through one of our wildlife coloring projects. If there's a mortality, we try and get samples off those animals. If the conservation officers have to dispatch an animal, we try and get samples off those animals. So, yeah, every sample that we can get our hands on is really valuable. Really, to be able to pick this up, because when CWD is first introduced to a population, it's likely going to be at a very small percentage of animals infected, and so you need to test a lot of animals. So if we can access as many animals as possible that are already being removed from the landscape, then that would be great. And we are far from overwhelmed in terms of the number of animals that we're testing. We can test a lot more. So that's our goal.
From a testing basis, is it the brain matter that has to be like it's always the heads that are turned in, but can you use the flesh or any other part of the animal to test?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, traditionally, hunters have turned in the head, but what we actually don't need the brain. It's on all the different cervid species, we collect a lymph node at the back of the throat. It's called a retropharyngeal lymph node, and that's sort of the gold standard for the sample that we want. With deer, we also collect tonsils, just like us. It's just a tonsil at the kind of roof of the mouth, back of the throat. And so for deer, because both that lymph node and the tonsils are right at the back of the throat, the hunters have a few different options for how to turn in samples. The heads are great, and that's easy. We don't need the brain or the top part of the head at all. So we encourage hunters to take the antlers off. If it's a buck. If a hunter wants to do a European mount, then they can just submit the low jaw. So we have instructions on the website now that if you just remove the low jaw by cutting around the bone of that low jaw bone, all the tissues that we need are protected at the back. So just that low jaw with some of the soft tissue at the back of the throat, that's all we need. And then a third option is we're offering, we're doing a lot of workshops right now with hunters to just sort of provide training on how to collect the tissues off their own animals. And so we have some hunters now that when they're processing their animals, they're actually just collecting the tonsils and the lymph nodes and submitting those frozen in a Ziploc bag. So they don't need to turn in any part of the head. And so, any way that we can facilitate that and support the hunter in getting those samples to us, making it as easy as possible, then that's great. On the elk, moose, and caribou, we do collect a slightly different suite of samples. So still that same lymph node at the back of the throat, but we also take a piece of the brainstem called the obex, and that's right at the base of the skull, right sort of at that junction between that first vertebrae and the base of the skull. And so for that reason, on those species, hunters can't just submit the low jaw. We do need the head intact. And so hunters are still turning in the whole head with the antlers taken off. That's no problem. Or again, hunters can learn how to collect that obex. It's pretty straightforward. It's right at the opening of the base of the skull where the spinal cord kind of splits. There's like a little V section, and we literally go into the base of the skull with a grapefruit spoon, if those little skinny spoons, and we pull that obex tissue out, and again that can just be frozen in a Ziploc bag, so hunters can turn that in.
What kind of turnaround time are you looking at? When I was out in Alberta, I think I hunted last fall out there, and I harvested a mule deer, and I submitted the sample, and I had it like incredibly quick. It was within a few days, or certainly within a week. So kind of, I gave the confidence that consuming the meat, because it is such a problem in Alberta, right? Mm-hmm. So what time frames are we looking like in BC for a turnaround on a report? That
has been a real struggle in BC, and it's varied through, over the years. We used to have a pretty good turnaround time. We've always submitted samples to the University of Saskatchewan because we didn't have a lab here in BC to run CWD testing. And 10 years ago, we had like a 2 or 3 week turnaround because programs across Canada were sort of, they weren't they weren't testing that many animals, and so it was pretty good. But as the CWD surveillance programs across Canada have expanded and testing more and more animals, then we just kind of, the capacity at the lab was limited, and so that turnaround on result became longer and longer and longer. Last year it was pretty bad. It was I think anywhere from 6 to probably 10 weeks for a turnaround on our results for the BC samples. And frankly, that's just not acceptable. I know that that's very frustrating for hunters that are submitting samples. I mean, we as a wildlife health program, we can't offer a food safety sort of service. We don't have those types of resources to offer a food safety service for hunters, but we do, absolutely rely on these samples, and so we want to provide that result back to the hunter as soon as we can. And so, and for us too, I mean, for surveillance, it's really important to get that information as soon as possible, right? But honestly, like my motivation is, I'm grateful for the support and that partnership from hunters. We really couldn't run this program without them. So anything I can do to support hunters in participating, and that means getting that result back as soon as possible. So we've tried to do a couple different things to expedite the result. This year we tried to do some prep samples in BC before they were shipped off to Saskatchewan, to try and get a better turnaround on results. But again, just capacity issues and the avian influenza outbreak sort of kind of pulled some resources in a different direction, and again we've had a delay in the results this season, which is really frustrating for me, and I know it's frustrating for hunters as well. Our dream has always been, and Helen and I have been pushing for this for 15 years, to get a lab set up in BC to do CWD testing, so that we have a little bit more control over the resources that go into it, and we're not competing with other programs in terms of getting in the lineup for the test. So next year we're hopeful that our agriculture lab in Abbotsford is going to have a platform for testing CWD, and we're hopeful that turnaround on results will be much tighter. So that's the goal for next year. It's been our goal to try and reduce that time, but I know it has been a real struggle. So hopefully next year with this the BC lab for the first time, I mean, this has been the dream. Hope it all comes together, and we'll be able to offer a shorter turnaround time.
Awesome. Now, with the would it change if we had a actual case of CWD? Is there something that triggers for you guys? Oh, infectious diseases here. And then of course there are some triggers. There's some things that obviously some management actions that are going to change, but does it change the status and okay, it's here now, and now we have these levers we can pull that we couldn't before?
Yeah, fortunately or unfortunately, I think absolutely. If we got a positive case in BC, I think we would be able to access more resources. Hopefully, we have this outlined in our response plan, that just the response effort alone is going to require resources, but longer term, just managing the disease and doing effective surveillance will require more resources, will require more capacity, and our sample numbers will surely increase as well. So now we're dealing with a larger volume of samples that we're going to need to address all of those resource pressures, right? So yeah, as a reportable disease, there's definitely levers under the Animal Health Act that will be triggered in terms of some different tools that we'll have at our disposal. But yeah, I think hopefully across the board, and I know there's always competing priorities and limited resources, but I imagine once we get that first case, we're going to need to adjust accordingly. Unfortunately, I think when we get that first case, it might be too late, right? to have those resources to support the advice that we're getting from sort of the CWD experts and other places that have been dealing with this disease for a number of years now, is that like we are in BC is in that critical time right now where we need to make sure that we do everything we can right now to have our preventative measures like really tight and our surveillance really tight so that we can ensure that we're going to catch it early, because that's our best chance of minimizing the negative outcomes for wildlife in the province. And then, the impacts to all the folks that rely on wildlife, right? So this is really a key time. So I hope that we can even, we can build support and build that capacity even before we get that first detection, so that, we can do our best to stay ahead of this.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Cait, is there a Cait in every jurisdiction across Canada? Does everybody have a CWD sort of point person, or is BC kind of unique in that regard? And what provinces are there? Anyone else that's CWD free, or what's the status across North America? I guess let's just do Canada, really.
Yeah. So yeah, there's kind of a Cait in every jurisdiction. I mean, some of the programs are set up differently. Obviously, Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba now are in the thick of it, and so they've got teams in place and more resources. For sure, they're testing many more animals every year. But yeah, that's kind of the sort of wildlife health programs across Canada will have somebody dedicated to CWD in general. Yeah, and then of course in the States, we're envious of some of their CWD programs in the States. Like, Montana hires 84 technicians every year to support their CWD surveillance, and so we don't have those kind of those kind of resources up here.
That was my question: is what are you a one man or one woman team, or is there a bunch of technicians that support you? And what does that compare to, for example, Alberta? And then of course we got the Montana example there. So I'm curious what and budgets too. Like what's a budget in BC versus Alberta versus obviously Montana, which would be huge.
Yeah. So I work for the BC Wildlife Health Program. There's 4 of us. 3 biologists report to the wildlife veterinarian, so that's Kylie. And our team is tackling a number of different wildlife health issues, but we have sort of been assigned specific programs, specific areas. And so chronic wasting disease is my responsibility. I've been managing that program for, I'm going to say 12 years, something like that. And so we all support each other within the wildlife health team. My colleagues and, Kylie, Sherry, Maeve, they're amazing. And I couldn't do it without them. They help with sampling, and I send them off to do, we do game checks with conservation officers. We do big sampling sessions out in the Kootenays. And so they're all, like, it's amazing. But I'm, that's taking them away from other tasks that they're responsible for, right? So as far as a dedicated person, it's just me. I've been able to access some funds to hire some part-time seasonal coordinators. So we've got some contractors in some of our priority areas that are helping to manage sort of on the ground operations, manage freezers, acting as sort of the local point point of contact for the community. But those are, pretty part-time seasonal positions as well. I don't have a dedicated budget aside from my salary for CWD, so we apply for external funding or other funding to support CWD every year. The Together for Wildlife strategy has been our primary source of funding for the last couple of years. Was able to access some HCTF funding this year to work on some management planning and look at some management actions that have been applied elsewhere that might be useful to us here in BC. So there's different, every year it's a little bit different, but we apply for funding, and then that's what runs the CWD program here. So yeah, our budget this year was $150,000. I don't know what Alberta's is, but the last couple of years, Margot said $1 million for Alberta for their budget. So yeah, we're running on a shoestring, sort of counting on, we're reliant on a lot of people are volunteering their times and freezer hosts and all that kind of stuff, people helping on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. That's, you kind of wish that, we had $500,000 or $300,000 budget and we could do the prevention and then not have to spend $1 million or $2 million or $5 million afterwards but yeah. So for our listeners, Cait, what can BC hunters and I guess people outside our jurisdictions, what can they do to help? What are some of the signs? Like if somebody's out in the field and they see an infected, they think might be an infected deer, what steps should they take and what do they need to do to support you in your program?
Great. Okay, thanks. Let's just talk about the signs first of all, because that's another tricky one. Is most animals that test positive for CWD look perfectly normal, look perfectly healthy. So in Alberta, for instance, I talked to lots of hunters that harvest animals in Alberta, and they're like big, healthy, good nutritional condition animals, and then they've tested positive for CWD. So there's in general, there's no real way when you've harvested an animal to visually, determine whether they have CWD or not. That's why we collect those tissues. So those tissues are actually, taken to a lab and either looked at under a microscope, or they do like an assay to determine if those prions are present. There's no way to visually determine that with an animal. Most animals look totally normal. And so we don't tend to see sick animals on the landscape. Even in Alberta, where there's a large percentage of those populations in the east are infected, like 50% of the mule deer populations in eastern Alberta are infected with CWD, but they just don't see sick animals on the landscape. So that's not, it doesn't provide us with that sort of signal or warning sign that there's something wrong. That said, at the later stages of the disease, the symptoms might include things like, really thin animals, like extreme sort of emaciation of, extreme weight loss, and then the neurological symptoms like the poor coordination, kind of trembling or stumbling. There's descriptions of animals that are just kind of drooling, just looking, abnormal. Of course, we want to hear about those. If anyone ever observes those types of signs on the land, then definitely reach out to Wildlife Health or to me directly. We'd like to hear about those cases for sure. So anyway, that's the tricky part about that. But yeah, in general, what hunters and folks could do to help, if you hear this, listen to this podcast or whatever, seek out the information, take this information and share it. Help us spread the word. Help us increase awareness. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, particularly if there's other hunters in your community that might not be aware of this. We're trying to produce resources through our website and share that through our partners to, share on their different, social media platforms and things like that. So seek out that information and share it as much as you can. That would be really helpful to us. And then, of course, submit samples for testing. Any deer, elk, or moose or caribou that's harvested in BC, we would like to test that for CWD. We know that we don't have maybe the best infrastructure set up. Like, we've got several freezers set up in the south now. So trying to make that really convenient for people to drop off samples. We don't necessarily have that set up in other parts of the province. So if you're in an area that doesn't have a freezer, reach out, let us know where a convenient location might be. Connect with, a local business in your area or, clubs, and see if someone would be willing to host a freezer. That would be really helpful to us to just kind of build that capacity and facilitate more samples coming in. So all that would be really helpful. Yeah, just, I'm so grateful to all the support, all the samples that hunters provide. We really could not, this program wouldn't exist without that support and that partnership. And things are just going to get trickier from here, right? And so I think it's super important that we're working together and strengthening and building those partnerships so that we can kind of face this with a team effort. It's good because that's what's going to be required.
Yeah. Now, if you're interested in supporting, like, let's say I go out and harvest a blacktail here or something and want to get you some data, do I drive it down to the lab or somebody's in the Lower Mainland, Prince George? How do they get that stuff to you? What is it, like, physically, how would that work?
Yeah. So we have on our website, we have a CWD website with a list of our freezer locations. And I point people to that because we're trying to add freezer locations all the time. I think we added another 4 or 5 freezers just in the last couple of months. So check the website for a freezer location. If you don't have a freezer location in your area, call me. My phone number is right on the website, and I'll try and connect you with somebody. Sometimes our regional wildlife biologists or conservation officers can help out and receive a sample. If you're on Vancouver Island, we're based in Nanaimo, so folks can always bring them here if that's convenient. But in other parts of the province, just give us a call and I will try to connect you with a convenient spot to bring samples to.
So this is just my brain trying to satisfy its curiosity. But so you got this limited budget, and so somebody drops a head off, right? They throw one in the freezer. Who's doing that work? Like, where's the budget? Where's the money coming from? How do people do that? And how do they get that information? How does that information get to the lab? There's got to be a process. It's not you driving down to Cranbrook to Cape Out. I spend the majority of the hunting season on the road. Going, is that right?
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. Between me and my team and my contractors, we're all pretty hair straight back right now. I've been to various corners of the province over the last couple of months. It's a lot of work, but again, it's, we're committed to processing these samples as soon as possible and getting the samples off to the lab so we can get those results back to the hunter. It's overwhelming. It's a lot of work, but it's also really rewarding when I can get out into communities and connect with people and we'll have these big sessions out in Cranbrook and people hear about it and hunters will bring their harvested animals right to the warehouse for us to sample, and then you get to have conversations with people and that's another opportunity to increase awareness and so that's what we do and it's not perfect. There's delays and we can't be everywhere all the time, but we're doing our best to keep the samples rolling and talking to hunters a lot about ways to improve those systems for sure. But yeah, we're doing our best.
Yeah, that's amazing. So how was this year? Did you meet your criteria, what you were wanting to get in terms of samples? Were you under, over? Where'd you end up with that?
Yeah, I don't have the total sample numbers for this season, but my sense is that we're tracking low.
Okay.
We've basically, the majority of the samples that we're getting right now are coming out of those mandatory units in the Kootenay region, in Region 4. Yeah, like I said, the numbers from last year, for example, we tested about 1,250 animals across the province last season, and I think 850 came out of the Kootenay region. So the majority out of the southeast there. I would say that and that was our target for the province annually is 3,000 animals. So last year we were just below 50% of what we wanted, and this year I would say our numbers are not much down, but definitely lower than last year so far. Again, most of the samples coming out of the Kootenay region, but we've had some pretty good participation in the Okanagan. Numbers are up in the Okanagan, still well below our target, but a lot of groups locally are setting up new freezers, and that's been really helpful. Likewise, in the Lower Mainland, we had some more freezer locations set up this year. So numbers are coming up in some areas, but where we really need them in the Region 4 and the Northeast, I would say we're well below targets. The samples we're getting right now are low and not providing much confidence in that data is not really giving us that confidence in a disease status, to confirm our disease status. So yeah, so that's kind of where we're at right now. I would absolutely like to see the numbers increase. I would say, yeah, double or triple across the board is closer to what we would need them at.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, well, I know I've taken a bunch of your time today. Is there anything else, just wrapping up, that any message you want to get out to any prospective hunters or even just the public out there that we can share today?
Yeah, no, I want to thank you, Kyle, so much for the opportunity. Venues like this are so valuable for us in sharing this information and helping to get the word out. So I really appreciate that. And if there any folks are listening to this and have more questions, please do reach out. Hopefully you'll be able to share our contact information on your platform here, Kyle. I'm always happy to get a phone call or an email if anyone has questions or ideas. Encourage folks to get involved, and whether that's get involved in one of our working groups, or if you have an opportunity to sort of organize or host an information session in your community, like any of that kind of stuff would be really helpful to us. So I'm always open to those types of ideas, so please reach out. And again, just massive thank you and gratitude to the hunting community across BC, all of our partners that support this program. We really couldn't do it without you. So thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Cait, for leading the charge on this. It's such an important file, and yeah, hopefully we can keep growing the support for it and do our best to keep that nasty disease out of the province. So.
Yeah, let's do that. Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you.